Please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
A quiet beginning. Have you ever looked at someone for only 3 seconds and somehow felt your entire future become strangely quiet? Not louder. Not dramatic. Just quiet. Like your brain stopped arguing with itself for the first time in years. That was exactly what happened to me during my first winter in America. And honestly, I almost missed it because I was too busy pretending I understood English better than I actually did. Back then, my listening skills were terrible. Americans spoke like they were being chased by invisible bees. Every sentence sounded connected together like one giant noodle of confusion. I smiled at people constantly because smiling was cheaper than saying, "Sorry, can you repeat that slowly for the 7th time?" If you've ever tried learning English while feeling lonely, embarrassed, broke, tired, and emotionally confused at the same time, congratulations. Your brain deserves a small vacation and maybe a donut. Mine definitely did. I had moved to a small town in Oregon where the air smelled like rain, coffee, and wet trees almost every morning. Everything felt different from the life I knew before. The supermarkets were too big. The milk came in giant containers that looked prepared for natural disasters. Even the silence felt different in America. People smiled politely, but everyone also seemed busy protecting their own invisible bubble. I worked part-time at a tiny bookstore cafe near a train station. It was the kind of place where people ordered coffee using words like half-caf oat milk vanilla latte with extra foam. While I still celebrated understanding basic phrases like "have a nice day," my manager once asked me to wipe down the counter. And I froze for 5 full seconds because my brain translated it into something involving emotional breakdowns instead of cleaning. Language learning is funny like that. Neuroscientists actually say the brain processes emotional stress and second language learning in overlapping areas. So when you feel anxious speaking English, your memory literally becomes weaker for a moment. Basically, your nervous system turns into a dramatic actor during a school presentation. One rainy Tuesday evening, right before closing time, he walked into the cafe wearing a dark green jacket covered in tiny drops of rain. Not movie star handsome. Not rich looking. Not mysterious in the dangerous Netflix way. He simply looked calm. Like someone who did not rush through life. And in America, that already felt rare. He ordered black coffee and a blueberry muffin. Simple. Slow. Quiet. I remember panicking because he spoke gently, which somehow made understanding him even harder. Fast English is difficult, but soft English? Soft English feels like someone whispering secrets underwater. He smiled and repeated himself slowly after noticing my confused expression. "No hurry," he said. "Take your time." It was such a small sentence. 6 simple words. But something inside me relaxed immediately. You would be surprised how powerful patience sounds when you are struggling in another language every single day. Most people correct your grammar before they understand your heart. He did the opposite. Over the next few weeks, he kept returning to the cafe around the same time each evening. Sometimes he brought a book. Sometimes he just sat near the rainy window quietly drinking coffee while typing on an old silver laptop that looked like it survived 2 wars and a tax audit. We started having tiny conversations. Very tiny. Painfully tiny. The kind of English conversation that would make advanced speakers cry from boredom. Cold today. Yes, very cold. Busy cafe. A little busy. Honestly, a houseplant could probably speak more fluently. But those conversations became the favorite part of my day. Here's something strange about learning English through emotional connection. Your brain remembers feelings faster than grammar rules. Researchers call this emotional anchoring. When words become connected to meaningful experiences, memory becomes stronger and more natural. That's why I still remember the exact way he said drive safe one snowy night. My English textbook never achieved that level of emotional damage. One evening the power suddenly went out during a storm. The cafe became dark except for soft emergency lights near the floor. Outside, rain hit the windows so hard it sounded like handfuls of rice thrown against glass. My manager rushed to the back room complaining about electrical problems while I stood frozen behind the counter wondering whether customers would panic. He didn't panic. He laughed quietly and said, "This feels like the beginning of a sad indie movie." I laughed too, mostly because I understood the sentence immediately without translating it inside my head first. That moment felt enormous. If you've ever learned English slowly, you know exactly what I mean. Sometimes understanding one sentence naturally feels bigger than graduating from college. He stayed until closing time because the storm became worse. We talked for almost an hour in slow English. Not perfect English. Human English. Broken English. Careful English. Honest English. He asked where I came from. I asked why he always came to the cafe alone. He shrugged and said, "Quiet places help me think." Then he looked at me for a second before adding, "And I like talking with you." My brain completely stopped functioning after that sentence. Scientifically speaking, I probably lost 80% of my vocabulary immediately. Love might not make people stupid, but nervous attraction definitely kidnaps grammar skills. After that night, everything changed slowly. Not dramatically. That's the funny part. Movies teach people that love arrives like fireworks exploding over a city skyline. Real love sometimes arrives like warm soup during a difficult winter. Quiet. Steady. Easy to miss if you are distracted. We started taking short walks after my shifts ended. The streets smelled like wet pavement and pine trees. He spoke slowly on purpose so I could practice listening. Sometimes he taught me American expressions that made absolutely no sense. Piece of cake. Hit the road. Break a leg. English honestly sounds like a language invented by exhausted raccoons. But for the first time since moving to America, I stopped feeling ashamed of learning slowly. He never laughed when I mispronounced words. Once I accidentally said beach incorrectly in public, creating one of the most terrifying moments of my immigrant experience. He nearly choked laughing but still corrected me kindly afterward. That mattered more than perfection. Because maybe the real reason people quit learning English is not laziness. Maybe they simply get tired of feeling embarrassed all the time. And maybe love, real patient love, gives people enough safety to keep trying anyway. I did not know then that this quiet man with rain on his jacket would eventually become my husband, the father of my children. And the reason America slowly began feeling like home instead of a giant confusing English exam. But on that first winter night inside a dark cafe, while rain crashed outside and my nervous hands held 2 cups of coffee, I felt something strange begin. Not fast. Not loud. Just slow enough to last. Rainy days and coffee. There is something deeply suspicious about American coffee shops during rainy weather. They make you believe your life is becoming meaningful even when you are just sitting there wearing an oversized sweater, emotionally confused, and pretending to understand a menu with 12 kinds of milk. That winter in Oregon, rain became part of my daily routine so completely that I started measuring time by the sound of water hitting windows. Soft rain meant normal customers. Heavy rain meant lonely customers. And thunder? Thunder meant people suddenly ordering expensive desserts like the economy was ending tomorrow. I worked evening shifts almost every day, and somehow he always appeared right when my energy disappeared. Around 6:30. Sometimes 6:45. Never exactly the same time, but always close enough that my stupid heart started expecting him. That's the dangerous thing about small routines. Your brain turns them into emotional furniture. One missing chair and suddenly the entire room feels wrong. By then, our conversations had become longer. Not fluent. Definitely not smooth. But warmer. We talked in slow English because my listening skills still needed help, and honestly, he seemed to enjoy slowing down too. There's actual psychology behind that. Studies show people feel more emotionally connected when conversations happen at a calmer pace. Fast conversations impress people. Slow conversations reveal them. One rainy evening he asked if I wanted to sit with him during my break instead of hiding in the tiny employee room where the microwave smelled. Permanently haunted by burnt noodles. I said yes too quickly and nearly knocked over a container of sugar packets trying to act casual afterward. Very elegant behavior. Truly the face of modern romance. Outside, the streets looked silver under the streetlights, and the cafe windows fogged up from the cold air mixing with warm coffee steam. America looked different at night. Softer somehow. During the daytime, everything felt loud and productive and fast. But rainy evenings slowed the whole town down like someone pressed pause on life. He asked me what surprised me most about living in the United States. I laughed immediately. Everything, I said. Americans put ice in drinks during winter. That still scares me. He laughed so hard he nearly spilled coffee on his laptop. Then I told him more. I told him how strange it felt seeing strangers smile at each other while still keeping emotional distance. How supermarkets sold 50 kinds of cereal but somehow only one cashier line was open. How people said "How are you?" without waiting for a real answer. Cultural differences are funny because at first they seem small, almost cute, until one day you realize they quietly affect your emotions every hour. Psychologists call this cultural fatigue. Your brain stays alert constantly because nothing feels fully automatic anymore. Even buying toothpaste can feel like participating in a game show. He listened carefully while I talked, and that alone felt unusual. Back home, people often interrupted each other naturally during conversations. But Americans, especially in smaller towns, sometimes listened with this calm patience that made silence feel safe instead of awkward. He told me he grew up nearby and had never left Oregon for more than a few months. I guess I've always been boring, he joked. No, I said quietly. You're peaceful. The moment those words escaped my mouth, I wanted to crawl directly into the coffee machine and disappear forever. But he smiled differently after that. Softer. Like the sentence mattered. Rain continued tapping against the windows while jazz music played quietly through old speakers above us. Somewhere near the counter, a tired college student was pretending to study while clearly scrolling through relationship drama on her phone for the third hour straight. Honestly, Cafes are just emotional support buildings with pastries. We started meeting outside the cafe sometimes. Short walks. Nothing dramatic. One afternoon he showed me a small bookstore downtown where the wooden floors creaked loudly every time someone walked past the history section. Another day we visited a farmer's market where I accidentally spent $9 on organic soap because the seller described lavender like she was introducing a future husband. America is dangerous when people become passionate about handmade products. Through all these small moments, my English improved without me noticing. That's the strange magic of emotional learning. When language becomes attached to laughter, attraction, comfort, or curiosity, the brain absorbs it differently. Researchers studying memory formation found that emotional experiences strengthen neural pathways, especially in language acquisition. Basically, your brain becomes a tiny hoarder collecting emotionally important sentences forever. I still remember him teaching me the phrase rain check. I thought it literally involved weather forecasts. He laughed for almost 2 minutes. But after explaining it slowly, he added, "See? Now you'll never forget it." And he was right. One Sunday evening, after my shift ended, rain started pouring so heavily that the streets looked like rivers under the streetlights. I stood near the cafe entrance staring outside dramatically like a character in an indie film who definitely makes bad romantic decisions. I didn't own a car yet, and walking home meant 20 freezing minutes through cold wind and soaked shoes. He noticed immediately. "I can drive you," he said casually. My brain reacted like he had proposed marriage inside a cathedral. "Calm down," I told myself. It is literally just transportation. But when you are lonely in a foreign country, kindness becomes dangerously powerful. During the drive, soft music played quietly while rain blurred the windows. Oregon roads at night felt endless and peaceful, surrounded by dark trees and glowing houses in the distance. He asked if I missed home. The question hit harder than expected. I stared outside for a moment before answering honestly. Every day, I admitted. But sometimes I think I miss the version of myself that felt confident there. Silence filled the car gently, not painfully. Then he said something I still remember years later. "Maybe you're not losing yourself," he said. "Maybe you're becoming someone new." It sounds simple now. Almost like a quote printed on expensive candles. But at that moment, those words reached something exhausted inside me. Because moving to another country changes more than language. It changes identity. You become slower, quieter, more careful. Even your personality needs subtitles for a while. When he parked outside my apartment building, rain still hammered the roof of the car. Neither of us moved immediately. You know those moments where nothing technically happens, but emotionally everything shifts? It felt exactly like that. Then he smiled slightly and said, "I like rainy days more now." My nervous system completely collapsed after that sentence. Honestly, scientists should study romantic tension instead of space travel because one meaningful look can destroy human logic faster than gravity ever could. That night, lying awake in my tiny apartment while rain continued outside my window, I realized something dangerous was happening very slowly. I was no longer practicing English just to survive America. I was beginning to connect the language with warmth, safety, attraction, and home. And maybe that is why slow love sometimes lasts longer. It doesn't arrive like fireworks. It arrives like rain. Quiet at first. Then suddenly everywhere. Learning English through love. Nobody tells you that learning English in America can feel strangely similar to falling in love. At first, everything sounds exciting but confusing. People speak too fast. Your heart races for no reason. You replay tiny conversations in your head at 3 in the morning like your brain suddenly became a low-budget podcast. And somehow one small compliment can emotionally destroy you for an entire week. By the beginning of spring, I had started understanding more English naturally, but not because of textbooks. Honestly, my grammar books spent most of their time collecting dust beside my bed like abandoned gym equipment after New Year's resolutions die. The real reason my English improved was him. Or more specifically, the way he spoke to me. Slowly. Patiently. Like I was a human being instead of a language problem waiting to be corrected. Every evening after work, we spent time together doing very ordinary things. Walking through grocery stores. Watching rain hit the sidewalks outside cafes. Sitting inside his car eating cheap French fries while talking about childhood memories and weird American traditions. It sounds simple, but simple conversations changed my brain more than years of formal studying ever did. Researchers studying language acquisition discovered something fascinating. Humans remember language faster when emotional safety is present. Stress blocks memory formation, while emotional comfort strengthens it. In other words, your nervous system becomes a terrible teacher when it thinks you are under attack. That explained why I could memorize 20 vocabulary words at home and forget every single one the moment an American cashier asked, "Paper or plastic?" My brain reacted like I was being interrogated by federal agents instead of buying groceries. But with him, the fear slowly disappeared. One afternoon we visited a small diner outside town where old country music played softly in the background and every customer looked emotionally connected to pancakes. The waitress spoke incredibly fast while chewing gum with terrifying confidence. Normally I would panic immediately and smile like a malfunctioning robot. But this time, he leaned closer and quietly repeated the questions slowly after she walked away. She asked what you want to drink, he whispered gently. And if you want fries or salad. Such a tiny thing. Such a small act of kindness. But if you've ever struggled with listening comprehension in another country, you understand how comforting that feels. Language exhaustion is real. Scientists call it cognitive overload. Your brain works overtime translating sounds, reading expressions, understanding cultural meaning, and trying not to embarrass itself all at once. Basically, your nervous system becomes an unpaid intern working 12-hour shifts. We developed strange little habits together. Every day he taught me one new American phrase, and every day I taught him one expression from my language. Sometimes the translations became disasters. Once I tried explaining an expression that meant don't give up too early, but somehow my English version sounded like I was threatening vegetables. He laughed so hard he nearly inhaled coffee foam. Honestly, love may not solve every problem, but laughing together definitely makes confusion less painful. Slowly, English stopped feeling like a school subject and started feeling alive. Certain words became attached to memories. Snowfall reminded me of our late-night walks downtown. Comfortable reminded me of his old gray sweater that smelled like coffee and cedarwood. Take your time became my favorite sentence in the English language because he said it constantly whenever I struggled to explain myself. That sentence changed more than my speaking confidence. It changed how I saw myself. Before meeting him, I secretly believed slow learning meant failure. Social media makes language learning look terrifying sometimes. People online claim they became fluent in 3 months while casually drinking green juice at sunrise. Meanwhile, I felt proud understanding movie subtitles without crying emotionally halfway through. But real learning rarely happens dramatically. Neuroscientists say the brain builds language through repetition, emotional association, and gradual pattern recognition over time. Basically, your brain learns English the same way plants grow. Quietly. Slowly. While you stare at it impatiently demanding results. One evening we sat beside the river near downtown while cold wind moved through the trees around us. The sunset reflected across the water in soft orange colors that made everything look strangely cinematic. He asked me something simple. When did you start feeling more comfortable speaking English? I thought about it carefully before answering. When I stopped trying to sound perfect, I admitted. And when I stopped feeling scared of people. He nodded slowly like he understood more than I actually said. Because the truth was bigger than grammar. I had spent months trying to protect myself from embarrassment. Every conversation felt like a test. Every mistake felt personal. But emotional connection changes language learning completely. Studies show people speak more fluently when they feel accepted instead of judged. That's why children learn languages faster than anxious adults. Children make mistakes constantly without turning every error into an identity crisis. Adults, meanwhile, mispronounce one word in public and suddenly reconsider their entire existence. One night he invited me to dinner at his apartment for the first time. Now listen carefully. This was not a fancy apartment. Not even close. The kitchen looked like 2 exhausted college students had lost a cooking competition there several years earlier. There were books stacked everywhere, one dying houseplant near the window. And exactly one chair that made dangerous noises every time someone sat down. But somehow it felt warm. Real. Human. He cooked pasta while I watched nervously pretending I understood the recipe instructions written on sauce jars. At one point he handed me vegetables to cut and casually asked, "Do you think you'll stay in America permanently?" That question hit me harder than expected. Because honestly, I still didn't know. Some days America felt exciting and hopeful. Other days it felt lonely enough to physically hurt. Immigrants rarely talk openly about this emotional contradiction. You can feel grateful and homesick at the exact same time. Your heart becomes divided between places, languages, and versions of yourself. I stared at the cutting board for a moment before answering quietly. Maybe, I said. If I find something that feels like home. He looked at me carefully then smiled slightly. Maybe home isn't always a place. I wish I could say I responded smoothly after that sentence. I did not. My brain completely shut down like an overheated laptop. Romantic tension and second language processing are apparently terrible roommates inside the human nervous system. During dinner we talked for hours. Slowly. Comfortably. Sometimes I searched for words. Sometimes he waited patiently while I figured out sentences piece by piece. And strangely, those pauses stopped feeling embarrassing. They started feeling intimate. Because maybe real connection is not built through perfect communication. Maybe it is built through patient listening. That night, walking back to my apartment under cold spring air, I realized something quietly terrifying. I was no longer just learning English in America. I was building an entirely new emotional life inside another language. And somewhere between coffee shops, rainy streets, awkward grammar mistakes, and slow conversations near rivers, I had started falling in love without fully noticing when it happened. The scariest part? It didn't feel dramatic at all. It felt natural. Like hearing a sentence clearly for the first time after months of confusion. The fear of not belonging. There is a very specific kind of loneliness that only appears when you live in another country long enough to understand the jokes but still feel emotionally outside of them. It's strange because technically your life looks normal. You go to work. You smile politely. You learn new words. You buy groceries while pretending $12 for strawberries is completely reasonable behavior. But deep inside, something still feels disconnected, like your soul missed an important flight and never arrived with the rest of you. By summer, my English had improved enough that customers at the cafe stopped immediately switching to slower speech when talking to me. That should have felt encouraging. Instead, it terrified me a little. Because when people finally understand your language better, they also begin expecting more from you emotionally. More confidence. More belonging. More certainty. And honestly, I still felt like a tourist inside my own life. He noticed before I said anything. That's one of the dangerous things about being loved carefully. The other person starts hearing emotions hiding underneath your normal sentences. One evening after work, we walked downtown while warm air carried the smell of food trucks and rain-soaked pavement through the streets. Oregon summers are strange. The weather acts like it still doesn't fully trust happiness. We passed groups of friends laughing outside bars, couples sitting near restaurant windows. College students skateboarding badly with impressive confidence. Everyone looked connected to the world around them while I still felt slightly transparent, like I existed one emotional step behind everybody else. "You're quiet tonight," he said gently. I shrugged. Classic human behavior. Spend months building emotional intimacy, then immediately respond like a suspicious raccoon when someone asks how you feel. "Just tired," I lied. He looked unconvinced but didn't push further. That was another thing about him. He never forced conversations open. He waited for them naturally, like someone sitting beside a shy animal hoping it eventually comes closer on its own. Later that night, while sitting near the river with paper cups of coffee warming our hands, the truth finally escaped me. "Do you ever feel like people see you as temporary?" I asked quietly. He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I stared at the dark water moving below us before answering. "I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm visiting everyone else's real life." The sentence sounded dramatic after leaving my mouth, but it was real. Psychologists actually describe this experience among immigrants and international students as identity displacement. When your language, routines, humor, and social behavior change all at once, your brain temporarily loses its usual sense of stability. You become hyper-aware of yourself constantly. Even small interactions feel performative. You start monitoring your pronunciation, facial expressions, grammar, body language, everything. Basically, your nervous system becomes a paranoid theater director supervising every conversation. He listened quietly before asking, "Did something happen today?" I laughed softly. "Not one thing." That's the problem. Then I told him about the customer who complimented my English earlier that morning. Most people would think that sounds kind. But immigrants understand the strange sadness hidden inside compliments like that. Because no matter how long you live somewhere, phrases like "your English is so good" quietly remind you that people still see you as separate from themselves. Foreign. Temporary. Different. The brain remembers social exclusion more strongly than physical discomfort. Researchers discovered that rejection activates similar neural pathways as physical pain, which honestly explains why loneliness can make your chest feel weirdly heavy at 2 in the morning while you stare at the ceiling wondering if everyone secretly understands life better than you do. He stayed silent for a moment before speaking carefully. "Can I tell you something honestly?" he asked. I nodded. "You think everyone else belongs somewhere perfectly," he said. "But most people are just pretending they do." I wanted to disagree immediately, but part of me already knew he was right. America especially felt full of people quietly reinventing themselves. New jobs. New cities. New identities. Everybody looked confident on the outside while secretly Googling emotional survival instructions at midnight. Still, fear remained inside me. Because falling in love while feeling emotionally unstable is terrifying. Every happy moment comes with hidden anxiety attached to it. What if he eventually realizes I'm too complicated? Too foreign? Too uncertain? Too slow? Trauma researchers say humans naturally fear abandonment more strongly during periods of transition and instability. Your brain becomes desperate for safety while simultaneously expecting rejection, which is emotionally exhausting. Like carrying an umbrella indoors because your feelings predict thunderstorms. One Sunday afternoon he invited me to a barbecue with some of his friends outside town. The moment he mentioned it, my stomach tightened instantly. Social gatherings in another language are basically extreme sports. One-on-one conversations are manageable because people slow down naturally. Group conversations? Absolute chaos. Americans interrupt each other politely somehow while using slang that sounds invented 3 seconds earlier. But I said yes because I wanted to be brave. Terrible decision emotionally. The barbecue took place in someone's backyard surrounded by tall trees and hanging lights. Music played softly while people laughed near the grill holding drinks and paper plates covered in suspiciously enthusiastic amounts of potato salad. Everyone was friendly. Genuinely friendly. Which almost made things worse because I wanted desperately to fit in naturally. At first I smiled constantly and nodded like a confused politician during an interview. Conversations moved too quickly. People referenced TV shows I didn't know. Childhood memories I didn't share. Cultural jokes that flew over my head like emotional mosquitoes. Then someone asked where I came from, and suddenly the entire group turned toward me politely waiting for an answer. My brain immediately forgot every English word I had learned since birth. Fascinating survival mechanism. I answered awkwardly while feeling heat rise into my face. Nobody reacted badly. Nobody judged me. But insecurity doesn't require real danger. Sometimes your nervous system creates its own horror movie entirely for free. Later I wandered alone toward the edge of the backyard pretending to admire trees while secretly recovering emotionally beside a folding chair. He found me there a few minutes later holding 2 drinks. "Too much?" he asked softly. I nodded honestly this time. "I feel stupid around everyone." He sat beside me immediately. "You are speaking a second language in a country that still feels new to you," he said. "That's not stupidity. That's courage with anxiety attached." Honestly, that sentence deserved its own therapy office. We stayed there quietly while distant laughter and music drifted through warm evening air. Then he added something I never forgot. You keep thinking belonging happens when nobody notices your differences anymore, he said. But maybe real belonging happens when people notice and still choose you completely. Something inside me became very still after hearing that. Because maybe he understood what I feared most. Not grammar mistakes. Not cultural confusion. Not even loneliness. I feared becoming emotionally invisible. Forgettable. Temporary. But sitting there beside him under soft summer lights while the sounds of American life moved around us, I realized something slowly changing inside me. Maybe belonging was not about becoming identical to everyone else. Maybe it was about finding people who made space for your unfinished self. And maybe love, real, slow, patient love, does exactly that. It does not erase your fear immediately. It simply sits beside you long enough that fear stops feeling like the loudest thing in the room. A small apartment, big dreams. Nobody warns you that one of the most intimate moments in a relationship is not saying I love you. It is standing together inside a tiny apartment at midnight trying to figure out why the smoke alarm is screaming while frozen pizza burns in the oven and both of you are too tired to behave like emotionally mature adults. That was the exact moment I realized our relationship had quietly crossed into something serious. Not glamorous serious. Not movie trailer serious. Real serious. The kind where two people start building routines together before they fully understand what they are building. By autumn, we decided I would move into his apartment. Looking back now, the decision sounds huge. At the time, it felt strangely natural, like a sentence slowly completing itself. My lease was ending soon, rent prices kept climbing like they were training for the Olympics, and honestly, I already spent most evenings there anyway. Still, the idea terrified me. Living together reveals everything. Your habits. Your stress. Your weird emotional support snacks. Your ability to survive IKEA furniture instructions without threatening society. Dating someone is one thing. Sharing one bathroom with them is advanced level intimacy. His apartment sat above an old hardware store downtown. The building looked permanently exhausted, like it had seen too many winters and several questionable life choices. The apartment itself was small enough that if one person sneezed in the kitchen, the other person could probably hear it from the bedroom emotionally. But it had warm yellow lights, creaky wooden floors, and windows overlooking rainy streets where people hurried through cold mornings carrying coffee cups like survival equipment. Somehow, it already felt safer than anywhere else in America. The first week living together felt oddly exciting. We grocery shopped together. Cooked together. Folded laundry while arguing about whether socks mysteriously disappear in dryers or simply escape society voluntarily. Tiny domestic moments became strangely romantic. Scientists actually say shared routines strengthen emotional bonding because predictability increases feelings of safety in relationships. Basically, your brain starts associating ordinary life with emotional comfort. That's why hearing someone wash dishes can eventually feel more intimate than candlelit dinners. Of course, reality arrived quickly too. Real relationships are not built only through meaningful conversations beside rivers. They are also built through stress, money problems, misunderstandings, and discovering your partner somehow loads dishwashers like an unsupervised raccoon. One evening I came home exhausted after a difficult shift at the cafe. Customers had spoken unusually fast all day, my manager seemed stressed, and my brain felt like overheated soup. I walked into the apartment expecting comfort and immediately saw dirty dishes covering the sink, unfolded laundry on the couch, and his shoes somehow positioned directly in the center of the hallway like an obstacle designed by angry architects. Normally none of this would matter. But emotional exhaustion turns small inconveniences into dramatic documentaries. "Did you forget to clean today?" I asked too sharply. He looked up from his laptop immediately. "I was working all afternoon," he answered calmly. "I was going to do it tonight." Now here comes the dangerous part about speaking a second language during emotional moments. You know enough English to argue, but not always enough to express complex feelings carefully. Which means frustration sometimes exits your mouth wearing completely different clothing. "You always say later," I muttered. The moment silence entered the room afterward, I knew something shifted. Relationship psychologists describe this perfectly. Most couples do not fight about dishes or laundry. They fight about emotional interpretation hiding underneath ordinary situations. My tired brain translated unfinished chores into "I am carrying everything alone." Meanwhile his brain probably translated my criticism into "nothing I do is enough." Human communication is honestly terrifying when you think about it too deeply. He stood quietly for a moment before speaking softer than expected. "You seem unhappy lately," he said. That sentence hit harder than the argument itself because part of me already knew it was true. Not unhappy with him. Unhappy with myself. Living in America still felt emotionally complicated. My English improved, but some days I still felt mentally exhausted from translating life constantly. Work drained me. Financial stress followed me everywhere. And deep down, I worried he would eventually realize loving someone rebuilding themselves from scratch can become heavy over time. We sat together at the small kitchen table later that night eating accidentally overcooked pasta while rain tapped softly against the windows. Romantic atmosphere sponsored by emotional tension and burnt garlic. Finally I admitted the truth. "Sometimes I feel guilty," I whispered. "Because my life still feels messy here." He looked confused. "Everyone's life is messy." "Not like this," I said quietly. "I still feel like I'm learning how to exist here." He stayed silent for a second before laughing softly. Not mocking laughter. Warm laughter. "You think I know how to exist?" he asked. "I'm 32 years old and yesterday I spent 20 minutes searching for my phone while holding it." I laughed despite myself. Then he added something more serious. "You don't have to become perfect before building a life with someone." That sentence settled into me slowly. Because maybe immigrants carry invisible pressure all the time. Pressure to prove we deserve opportunities. Deserve love. Deserve stability. You feel grateful constantly while secretly terrified of failure. Neuroscientists studying chronic stress found that prolonged uncertainty increases emotional sensitivity and self-criticism. Basically, your nervous system becomes a dramatic motivational speaker screaming, "Improve faster or perish emotionally." But life together slowly softened that pressure. We created routines. Saturday morning grocery trips. Cheap movie nights on the couch. Late night conversations while sharing tea beside open windows listening to rain move through downtown streets. My English continued improving naturally because home itself became an English learning environment now. Researchers call this immersive emotional exposure. Language becomes more automatic when connected to repetitive real-life experiences. I stopped translating every sentence mentally because my brain finally relaxed enough to absorb patterns naturally. though misunderstandings still happened constantly. One morning he told me to grab the pan while cooking breakfast, and I somehow heard plant. I stood there holding a confused houseplant while he stared at me in complete silence. Honestly, relationships need humor or they collapse under the weight of bills and laundry immediately. Winter arrived early that year. Cold air slipped through tiny cracks near the apartment windows, and downtown streets smelled like coffee, wet pavement, and wood smoke. Some nights we sat wrapped in blankets eating instant noodles because payday still felt painfully far away. Social media would call that struggling. But strangely, those nights became some of my happiest memories. Because happiness in adulthood often looks less impressive than expected. Sometimes happiness is simply another person waiting for you at home after a difficult day. One snowy evening the electricity went out briefly across downtown. We sat in darkness lit only by candles while wind moved outside the windows. The apartment felt tiny and quiet around us. Then he reached for my hand and said softly, "You know what I realized?" "What?" I asked. "Nothing in my life feels temporary anymore." My chest tightened immediately after hearing that. Because for so long, temporary had been my biggest fear. Temporary visa. Temporary apartment. Temporary confidence. Temporary belonging. But somehow this small apartment above an old hardware store no longer felt temporary at all. It felt unfinished maybe. Imperfect definitely. But real. And maybe that is what lasting love actually looks like in real life. Not grand speeches or dramatic music. Just two tired people slowly building safety together while the world outside keeps rushing past the windows. Family dinner culture shock. There are few experiences more terrifying than meeting your boyfriend's family while speaking English as your second language. Skydiving? Relaxing. Horror movies? Cute. But sitting at a dinner table in America trying to understand 5 people talking at the same time while secretly praying you don't accidentally insult someone's grandmother? That is elite-level emotional cardio. The invitation came casually one Tuesday evening while we were folding laundry together in the apartment. And honestly, couples who survive folding fitted sheets together should probably receive government awards for emotional endurance. He looked up from a pile of towels and said, "My parents invited us for dinner this Sunday." Just like that. Calm. Simple. Meanwhile, my nervous system immediately reacted like a squirrel trapped inside a burning library. "Dinner?" I repeated slowly. "With your family?" He nodded, completely unaware that my brain had already begun producing disaster scenarios worthy of psychological documentaries. Here's the thing nobody explains properly about intercultural relationships. You are not only dating one person. Eventually, you also meet their traditions, humor, communication style, childhood memories, family habits, political opinions. And whatever strange casserole recipes survived 3 generations somehow. Love becomes cultural anthropology with emotional consequences. All week I worried obsessively. What should I wear? How formal are American family dinners? Should I bring food? Flowers? A gift? What if they spoke too quickly? What if they secretly disliked me? Research in social psychology shows humans fear social rejection more intensely in unfamiliar cultural settings because uncertainty increases threat perception in the brain. Basically, your nervous system transforms into a paranoid detective searching for danger in absolutely everything. Sunday arrived cold and gray. Oregon skies looked like someone had spilled soup across the clouds. During the drive, I sat quietly rehearsing English sentences in my head like a nervous actress preparing for a low-budget emotional thriller. Nice to meet you. Thank you for inviting me. Yes, the weather is beautiful. Honestly, English learners spend half their lives mentally preparing for conversations that never happen. His parents lived outside town in a small house surrounded by pine trees and wet grass. Warm yellow light glowed through the windows while smoke rose gently from the chimney. It looked so peaceful I almost distrusted it immediately. American houses in movies always seem emotionally suspiciously clean. The moment we walked inside, the smell hit me first. Roasted chicken. Garlic. Fresh bread. Cinnamon candles. Home. Real home. Not perfect home. Lived in home. His mother hugged me before I even processed what was happening. Americans can be confusing like that. One minute they protect personal space like national treasure, the next minute someone's aunt is emotionally adopting you beside mashed potatoes. We're so happy you're here, she said warmly. I smiled nervously and nearly forgot how coats functioned while trying to respond politely. His father shook my hand firmly while his younger sister waved casually from the kitchen holding a spoon covered in mashed potatoes like a tiny weapon. Everyone seemed kind immediately, which somehow made me even more anxious because now I desperately wanted them to like me back. Dinner itself felt like entering a completely different social universe. In my culture, meals often involved quieter rhythms and subtle politeness. Here, conversations bounced across the table constantly. People interrupted each other affectionately. Jokes appeared suddenly without warning. At one point his father started debating barbecue techniques with his sister while his mother simultaneously asked me questions about my childhood. My brain worked so hard translating everything that I genuinely forgot what food tasted like for several minutes. Cognitive scientists call this language fatigue. Your working memory becomes overloaded trying to process sounds, meaning, social context, and emotional reactions simultaneously. Basically, your brain starts buffering like weak internet during a storm. Then something embarrassing happened. Of course it did. That's how growth works, unfortunately. His mother asked if I wanted seconds, and I completely misunderstood. I thought she meant actual seconds, like time. So I answered, no, I think dinner time is normal. Silence covered the table for one painful second before everyone burst into laughter. Not cruel laughter. Warm laughter. Human laughter. Still, my face became approximately the temperature of lava. She means more food, he whispered gently beside me while trying unsuccessfully not to laugh himself. Oh, I said quietly. That makes more sense emotionally. Even I started laughing after that. And strangely, something important shifted inside me during that moment. Because nobody mocked me. Nobody acted annoyed. They simply explained the misunderstanding and continued talking naturally afterward. Sometimes acceptance enters your life disguised as ordinary patience. Later after dinner, we sat in the living room drinking tea while rain tapped softly against the windows. His mother showed me old family photo albums filled with awkward school pictures and terrible 1990s hairstyles. Humanity should collectively apologize for. I watched him laughing beside his family, relaxed in a way I had never fully seen before. Softer. Younger somehow. Love reveals hidden versions of people over time. That realization felt strangely intimate. Then his mother asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Do you miss home a lot?" she asked gently. The room became quieter afterward. Not uncomfortable. Just attentive. Honest. I looked down at my tea for a moment before answering carefully. "Yes," I admitted. "Sometimes more than I expect." She nodded slowly like she understood something deeper underneath the sentence. "That must feel exhausting," she said softly. And for some reason, those words almost made me emotional immediately. Because most people only talk about immigration like adventure or opportunity. Rarely do they acknowledge the grief hidden inside it too. You lose familiarity. Language confidence. Family closeness. Even simple things like understanding jokes instantly or knowing where your favorite snacks are in grocery stores. Your nervous system stays partially homesick for years sometimes. His father leaned back in his chair and said something simple that stayed with me forever. "Well," he said, "your family here too now." Such an ordinary sentence. 12 simple words. But emotionally? Absolute destruction. I smiled politely while internally experiencing a small earthquake. Neuroscientists studying belonging found that social acceptance strongly affects emotional regulation and long-term stress reduction. In other words, feeling welcomed literally changes how safe your brain feels inside the world. On the drive home later that night, rain moved softly across the windshield while quiet music played through the speakers. I stared out the window thinking about the evening. The jokes I half understood. The accidental misunderstanding about seconds. The warmth inside that small house surrounded by pine trees. Then he glanced at me briefly and smiled. "You survived," he joked. I laughed softly. Barely. He reached over and squeezed my hand gently before saying something quieter. "They really liked you." My chest tightened unexpectedly after hearing that. Because maybe the fear was never truly about language mistakes. Maybe the real fear was always deeper. The fear that no matter how much English I learned, I would still remain outside people's real lives somehow. But sitting there in the dark car while Oregon rain blurred the world outside, I realized something important. Belonging does not arrive all at once. It grows slowly through ordinary dinners, awkward conversations, misunderstood words, shared laughter. And people choosing to make room for you again and again until one day the loneliness becomes quieter than before. When love became quiet. Nobody talks enough about the strange moment when a relationship stops feeling exciting and starts feeling real. Movies usually end before that part happens. Right after the dramatic kiss, emotional music plays, credits roll. And apparently everyone survives forever on attractive lighting and perfect communication. Real life is less cinematic. Real love eventually becomes quieter. Not worse. Just quieter. And honestly, that change terrified me at first. About 3 years after we met, our relationship no longer looked like the beginning. We still loved each other deeply, but the energy had changed. The butterflies disappeared somewhere between utility bills, grocery shopping, work schedules, and arguing politely about whether leftovers should remain in the refrigerator long enough to qualify as scientific experiments. Our apartment felt different too. Familiar now. Lived in. The wooden floors still creaked at night, but I barely noticed anymore. My coffee mug permanently sat beside the window. His books slowly invaded every possible surface like intellectual mold. We had routines. Safe routines. Predictable routines. And for some reason, predictability made me nervous. Social media does something dangerous to modern relationships. It quietly teaches people that love should always feel intense, passionate, exciting, constantly dramatic. But psychologists studying long-term relationships found something completely different. Healthy couples often experience emotional calmness over time because the nervous system stops existing in permanent anticipation. Your brain eventually feels safe instead of stimulated. Basically, stable love can sometimes feel less like fireworks and more like finally taking off uncomfortable shoes after a long day. Still, part of me worried. One rainy evening while we washed dishes together after dinner, I caught myself thinking something terrifying. What if we are becoming boring? Honestly, adulthood is emotionally confusing because peace sometimes feels suspicious when you spent years surviving chaos. We stood quietly side by side in the kitchen while soft jazz music played from an old speaker near the counter. Rain moved gently against the windows outside. He dried plates while I washed them. Ordinary. Completely ordinary. Then suddenly he started dancing badly in the middle of the kitchen for absolutely no reason. No music performance. No audience. Just emotionally unstable dancing beside wet forks. What are you doing? I laughed. Improving the atmosphere, he answered seriously while continuing whatever physical crisis his body called dancing. I laughed so hard I accidentally splashed water across the floor. And weirdly, that tiny moment stayed with me afterward. Because maybe love becoming quieter does not mean love disappears. Maybe it simply changes language. Early love says, I cannot stop thinking about you. Mature love says, I bought your favorite tea because you looked tired yesterday. One sounds more dramatic. The other keeps people alive emotionally during difficult years. My English had improved so much by then that people rarely asked where I was from immediately anymore. That should have made me feel fully confident. Instead, I sometimes felt strangely disconnected from both versions of myself. Too changed to feel exactly like the person I was before America. Still different enough to feel slightly outside American culture too. Identity researchers call this bicultural tension. You begin existing emotionally between worlds instead of fully inside one. One afternoon after work, I confessed this feeling to him while we walked through a nearby park covered in orange autumn leaves. Sometimes I feel like I belong nowhere completely, I admitted quietly. He looked at me for a second before smiling softly. Maybe nobody belongs completely anywhere, he said. Maybe people just find places where they can rest for a while. Honestly, he deserved compensation for the amount of accidental therapy he provided me over the years. Around that time, another strange thing started happening too. We spent more time sitting quietly together without needing conversation constantly. At first I worried this meant we were losing connection. But neuroscience actually suggests the opposite can happen. Emotional safety allows the brain to relax socially, reducing pressure for continuous stimulation or performance. In simple language, silence feels less scary when someone truly knows you. Some evenings we sat beside each other reading different books while rain moved through downtown streets outside our apartment windows. Other nights we watched terrible reality TV shows while eating microwave popcorn and judging strangers' life decisions with unreasonable confidence. Nothing dramatic happened. But somehow those nights became precious. Then one difficult season arrived quietly without warning. He became stressed at work. I started taking additional shifts at the cafe to help financially. We saw each other less often despite living together. Tension appeared in small invisible ways first. Shorter conversations. Less laughter. More exhaustion. One night we argued because he forgot to buy groceries after promising he would. Another night I became irritated because he answered work emails during dinner. Tiny conflicts. But small emotional distance grows dangerously fast when ignored. Relationship researchers call this emotional erosion. Not betrayal. Not dramatic collapse. Just gradual disconnection through stress and neglect. One cold evening I came home late after an exhausting shift and found him asleep on the couch surrounded by paperwork and an unfinished cup of coffee. The apartment was quiet except for rain tapping softly against the windows. He looked tired even while sleeping. Older somehow. Human. Vulnerable. Suddenly I realized something uncomfortable. Love is easy to romanticize when both people feel emotionally energetic. But real love reveals itself most clearly during ordinary exhaustion. I covered him gently with a blanket before sitting beside the window quietly. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to admit the truth. I missed him even while living beside him every day. Emotional distance is strange like that. Two people can share the same apartment while secretly drifting into separate emotional climates. The next morning, before leaving for work, he handed me a small paper bag. "Open it later," he said sleepily. Inside was my favorite blueberry muffin from the cafe where we first met years earlier. No dramatic speech attached. No apology note. Just breakfast. But somehow that tiny gesture broke through weeks of tension immediately. Because maybe lasting love survives through microscopic acts of attention repeated over time. Psychologists studying successful long-term couples discovered something fascinating. Stable relationships are built less through grand romantic gestures and more through consistent small moments of emotional responsiveness. Tiny kindnesses. Small repairs. Quiet consideration. Basically, love survives because people continue noticing each other carefully. That evening we finally talked honestly. Really honestly. About stress. Fatigue. Fear. The strange loneliness adulthood sometimes creates even inside loving relationships. "I know things feel different now," he admitted quietly while sitting beside me on the couch. But different doesn't always mean worse. I leaned against him silently while rain moved across the windows outside. Then he added something that settled deep inside me. "The beginning of love is exciting because you are discovering someone," he said softly. "But later love becomes important because someone keeps choosing you after discovering everything." I thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. Because maybe slow love lasts longer precisely because it learns how to survive silence, stress, routine, disappointment, and ordinary life. It stops trying to perform constantly. It becomes less dramatic but more dependable. Like light left on quietly in another room while storms move outside. And maybe that kind of love does not look impressive online. But in real life? It feels like peace. The hard winter season. Nobody realizes how fragile adult life actually is until one bad season quietly rearranges everything. It usually doesn't happen dramatically. No emotional movie soundtrack. No giant warning sign falling from the sky. Real hardship arrives wearing ordinary clothes. An unexpected bill. A stressful phone call. A night of poor sleep that somehow becomes 3 months of exhaustion. And during the hardest winter of our marriage, it felt like life kept adding tiny weights onto our shoulders until even breathing emotionally started feeling expensive. By then we had been together for several years, and from the outside our life probably looked stable enough. We had routines, jobs, friends, a small apartment that finally felt fully ours. My English had improved so naturally that sometimes I even dreamed in English now, which honestly felt slightly illegal at first. But stability can become dangerously deceptive. Researchers studying chronic stress found something important. Humans adapt to pressure slowly, often without noticing how overwhelmed they actually become until emotional burnout already arrives. Basically, your nervous system keeps saying, "I'm fine," while quietly turning into microwaved soup internally. That winter began with money problems. Not catastrophic problems. Just the exhausting kind that follow you silently every day. Rent increased again. His work hours became inconsistent after company budget cuts. My cafe reduced staff shifts during slower months. Suddenly every grocery trip felt strategic. Every purchase required discussion. We started calculating everything constantly like emotionally unstable accountants surviving on caffeine and denial. One freezing evening we sat together at the kitchen table surrounded by unopened bills while cold wind rattled softly against the apartment windows. The heating system barely worked, and both of us wore sweaters indoors pretending this counted as personality instead of financial struggle. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly while staring at numbers written across a notepad. I nodded automatically, but fear already moved heavily inside my chest. Here is the strange thing about financial stress. It rarely attacks only money. It attacks identity, confidence, relationships, sleep. Neuroscientists discovered prolonged financial anxiety increases cortisol levels, which directly affect emotional regulation and communication. In simple language, stress slowly turns normal humans into exhausted emotional gremlins. We became quieter during those months. Not because love disappeared. Because survival became louder. He worked longer hours whenever possible. I picked up extra shifts at the cafe even when my body begged for rest. Some nights we passed each other inside the apartment like tired coworkers instead of partners. "Did you eat?" became more common than "how are you?" One night I came home late after a terrible shift where customers complained constantly while Christmas music played on repeat like psychological warfare. I opened the apartment door expecting warmth and immediately saw him sitting alone in darkness beside the window. No lights. No television. Just silence. My stomach tightened instantly. "Are you okay?" I asked softly. He didn't answer immediately. Then finally he said, "I got laid off today." The sentence felt like cold water poured directly into the center of my chest. He explained quietly that budget cuts hit harder than expected. His position disappeared completely. Just like that. Years of work erased during one meeting and a handshake. That night we barely slept. Rain hammered against the windows while both of us stared at the ceiling pretending our brains were not catastrophizing every possible future. Disaster. This is what chronic stress does to humans. Your thoughts stop existing in reality and begin auditioning for worst-case scenarios professionally. I worried constantly after that. About money. About visas. About health insurance. about whether love can survive exhaustion long-term. Immigrants especially carry extra layers of fear because instability threatens more than comfort. It threatens belonging itself. If life collapses in your home country, at least the language feels familiar while suffering. Struggling in another country feels lonelier somehow. During the following weeks, tension grew quietly between us. Tiny arguments appeared everywhere. Dishes left unwashed. Forgotten errands. Misunderstood comments. Relationship psychologists call this stress spillover. External pressure leaks into emotional connection until couples accidentally begin treating each other like the enemy instead of teammates. One snowy afternoon we argued because I bought the wrong brand of coffee. Coffee. Imagine destroying emotional peace over beans. But it was never truly about coffee. It was fear wearing a ridiculous disguise. You don't listen sometimes, he snapped suddenly. Silence filled the kitchen immediately afterward. I stared at him shocked because he rarely raised his voice. Then something painful happened. Instead of explaining my feelings carefully, I switched emotionally into survival mode. Maybe I'm tired of trying to fix everything alone, I answered sharply. The moment those words escaped my mouth, regret arrived immediately. Trauma researchers explain this perfectly. Under stress, humans become defensive faster because the brain prioritizes protection over connection. Basically, your nervous system starts throwing emotional furniture during arguments instead of solving actual problems. He grabbed his jacket and left the apartment without another word. I stood alone in the kitchen afterward staring at untouched coffee while snow moved silently outside the windows. And suddenly the apartment felt terrifyingly quiet. Here's the dangerous thing about loving someone deeply. During conflict, your brain briefly imagines losing them completely. Attachment psychologists found that emotional distance activates panic responses in close relationships because humans are biologically wired to fear disconnection from important bonds. Which honestly explains why relationship fights can feel physically painful sometimes. Hours passed. Darkness covered downtown streets. I sat beside the window replaying our argument repeatedly while anxiety twisted through my chest. Then around midnight the apartment door finally opened. He walked inside quietly carrying a paper bag from the convenience store downstairs. Neither of us spoke immediately. Then he held up 2 cheap microwave burritos and said softly, "Peace offering?" I laughed so suddenly I almost cried afterward. Because humans are strange creatures. Sometimes healing begins not through dramatic speeches but through frozen food and emotional exhaustion. We sat together on the couch eating terrible burritos while snow fell softly outside. Finally he looked at me and admitted something honest. "I'm scared all the time lately," he whispered. The vulnerability in his voice changed everything instantly. Because underneath all our tension, we were both carrying the same fear silently. Fear of failure. Fear of instability. Fear that adulthood was becoming heavier than expected. I reached for his hand quietly. "Me too," I admitted. And strangely, that moment mattered more than pretending to stay strong. Researchers studying emotional resilience discovered couples cope with hardship better when vulnerability becomes shared instead of hidden. In other words, humans survive difficult seasons more successfully when they stop performing strength constantly. Winter continued brutally after that. Money stayed tight. Stress remained real. But something shifted between us. We stopped pretending everything was fine. Some nights we sat together honestly discussing fears instead of swallowing them silently. Other nights we simply survived one day at a time. And weirdly, surviving together created intimacy too. One evening during a snowstorm the power briefly failed again, leaving the apartment dark except for candlelight. We wrapped ourselves in blankets beside the window while wind shook the building softly around us. Then he looked at me and smiled tiredly before saying something simple. "You know what's weird?" "What?" I asked. "Even during the hardest parts lately, I still never want to do life without you." That sentence stayed with me forever. Because maybe lasting love is not proven during easy, beautiful seasons. Maybe it reveals itself during winters when both people feel exhausted, uncertain, and emotionally fragile, yet still continue reaching toward each other in the dark anyway. Speaking slowly, healing slowly. Have you ever noticed that people speak faster when they are afraid? Faster when angry. Faster when trying to defend themselves. Faster when pretending everything is fine. But healing? Healing almost always happens slowly. Quietly. One careful sentence at a time. After the hardest winter of our relationship, something inside both of us changed. Not dramatically. No magical breakthrough. No cinematic moment where sad music stopped and emotional wisdom suddenly arrived from the sky like spiritual customer service. We were simply tired. Tired of stress. Tired of misunderstanding each other. Tired of acting strong while quietly falling apart inside. And strangely, that exhaustion became the beginning of something healthier. Spring arrived late that year. Oregon still looked cold and gray even in March, like the weather itself needed therapy before committing emotionally to sunshine again. He eventually found another job, though it paid less than before. Money remained tight, but at least the panic slowly loosened its grip around our lives. Still, emotional tension lingered between us in subtle ways. We spoke carefully now, like people recovering from invisible bruises. Relationship experts actually describe this phase as emotional hypervigilance. After periods of conflict or instability, couples often become overly sensitive to tone, silence, facial expressions, everything. Basically, your nervous system starts reading ordinary conversations like suspicious detective evidence. One evening after dinner, we sat quietly at the kitchen table while rain moved against the windows outside. The apartment smelled faintly like garlic and coffee. Ordinary smells. Ordinary life. Yet the silence between us felt unusually heavy. Then suddenly he asked something simple. "Are we okay?" The question landed softly but deeply. I stared at my tea for a moment before answering honestly. "I think we're trying to be." He nodded slowly like he understood exactly what I meant. Because sometimes relationships survive difficult seasons physically before they recover emotionally. You continue living together, talking, paying bills, surviving routines, but your hearts still move carefully around each other afterward. Like people walking across frozen lakes unsure how much weight the ice can hold now. That night we talked longer than we had in months. Real talking. Not logistical conversations about groceries or schedules or unpaid bills. Emotional talking. Vulnerable talking. Terrifying talking. I admitted something I had hidden quietly for years. "Sometimes I still feel scared you'll eventually get tired of me," I whispered. He looked genuinely shocked. "Why would you think that?" I laughed softly without humor. "Because I always feel like I'm still becoming someone. And I worry one day you'll want someone easier. Silence filled the room gently afterward. Trauma psychologists explain this perfectly. People who experience long periods of instability often develop fear-based thinking patterns in relationships. Even love feels temporary because your brain becomes trained to expect loss eventually. He reached across the table slowly and held my hand. You think love means never struggling, he said quietly. But everyone struggles. You're just honest about it. That sentence settled somewhere deep inside me. Because maybe healing starts the moment someone sees your fear clearly and still stays. Around that time, we created a strange new habit together. Every evening after work, we took short walks through downtown without phones, music, or distractions. Just walking. Talking slowly. Some nights we discussed serious things. Other nights we simply described random details around us like emotionally exhausted nature documentary hosts. That dog looks richer than us. That cafe definitely overcharges for muffins. Why do Americans wear shorts during freezing weather? Honestly, healing relationships sometimes look incredibly unglamorous. But neuroscience supports this beautifully. Slow repetitive connection helps regulate the nervous system and rebuild emotional safety after stress. In simple language, tiny peaceful moments matter more than dramatic apologies. During one walk, we passed the bookstore cafe where we first met years earlier. Warm yellow light still glowed through the windows while customers sat inside drinking coffee beside rainy glass. I stopped walking for a moment just staring at it quietly. What? He asked gently. I smiled softly. I barely understood English when we met. He laughed immediately. You barely understood me specifically. True, I admitted. Your voice sounded like a podcast underwater. We both laughed harder than expected after that. And suddenly something important hit me. In the beginning, we spoke slowly because I needed help understanding English. But now we spoke slowly for a completely different reason. We had learned that rushing conversations often damaged them. Fast reactions created misunderstandings. Fast assumptions created distance. Fast anger created regret. Slowing down emotionally changed everything. Researchers studying communication found that couples who pause before responding during conflict show significantly higher long-term relationship satisfaction. Basically, your nervous system becomes smarter when given 5 extra seconds not to behave like a raccoon trapped inside emotional chaos. One rainy Sunday morning we stayed in bed talking for hours while soft light moved through the apartment windows. No phones. No schedules. Just conversation. He asked me something unexpected. Do you think moving to America changed you permanently? I thought carefully before answering. Yes, I said finally. But not only because of America. He looked curious. Then why? I stared at the ceiling for a moment searching for the right words. Because learning another language changes how you feel emotions, I explained slowly. You become more patient. More observant. More careful. Sometimes lonelier too. Linguists actually discovered bilingual people often experience emotional processing differently depending on language context. Certain feelings become easier to express in one language than another. Which honestly explains why some of my deepest conversations with him happened in simple English instead of my native language. Simplicity removes performance sometimes. He listened quietly while I spoke before saying something I never forgot. Maybe that's why we worked, he said softly. We had to slow down enough to really hear each other. That realization followed me afterward for weeks. Because maybe modern relationships collapse partly from speed. Fast dating. Fast texting. Fast assumptions. Fast disappointment. Everybody wants immediate certainty now. Immediate chemistry. Immediate perfection. But real emotional intimacy grows slowly because humans are complicated creatures carrying invisible histories everywhere. One evening while cooking dinner together, music playing softly in the background, he suddenly wrapped his arms around me from behind and rested his chin on my shoulder. Such a small moment. Yet it felt different somehow. Calmer. Safer. No desperate intensity attached. Just closeness. Then quietly he whispered, I think we survived something important. I turned toward him slowly. Yeah, I answered. I think we did. Relationship researchers say couples who successfully navigate hardship together often develop deeper emotional resilience afterward because trust becomes experience-based instead of fantasy-based. In other words, love feels more real after proving it can survive difficult seasons. Later that night, rain tapping softly against the windows again like it always seemed to in Oregon, I realized something beautiful. Healing did not happen because our problems disappeared completely. Healing happened because we stopped trying to protect ourselves from each other constantly. We spoke slower. Listened better. Admitted fear sooner. And somewhere between difficult conversations, late-night walks, awkward apologies, and ordinary mornings drinking coffee together in silence, love became less about excitement and more about safety. Not boring safety. Not empty comfort. The kind of safety where two people can finally exhale honestly beside each other after carrying too much for too long. And maybe that is what lasting love really sounds like in the end. Not loud passion. Just two tired hearts learning how to speak gently again. The day we became parents. Nobody fully understands exhaustion until a tiny human enters the room and suddenly your entire nervous system starts operating on approximately 4 hours of sleep, cold coffee, and emotional confusion. People try explaining parenthood before it happens, but honestly, their descriptions are always suspiciously incomplete. They say things like your life changes forever, which sounds poetic and beautiful until you are standing in a grocery store at midnight buying diapers while wondering if your brain still remembers basic mathematics. The year we became parents began quietly enough. Life finally felt stable again after the difficult winter we survived together. He settled into a better job. I reduced my hours at the cafe and started teaching beginner English classes part-time at a small community center nearby. That part of my life surprised me most. Me. Teaching English in America. Years earlier I could barely understand fast conversations inside grocery stores. And now I stood in front of nervous immigrants explaining pronunciation and listening exercises with calm confidence. Sometimes life grows in circles so slowly you only notice change after looking backward. One rainy evening after class, I walked home through cold Oregon streets carrying leftover teaching materials inside my bag while mentally planning dinner. The apartment windows glowed softly from outside, warm light spilling onto wet sidewalks below. Ordinary scene. Ordinary life. Then everything changed because of one sentence. I walked inside and found him sitting on the couch smiling strangely. You okay? I asked immediately. He nodded slowly, then held up a pregnancy test with the expression of a man whose soul had temporarily left his body for emotional processing. For exactly 5 seconds, my brain stopped functioning completely. Not metaphorically. Literally nothing happened internally. Then suddenly emotions arrived all at once like an overcrowded airport terminal. Fear. Shock. Joy. Panic. Love. Confusion. Honestly, human biology is aggressive sometimes. Are you serious? I whispered. He laughed nervously. I don't think pregnancy tests usually joke. Then somehow we both started laughing and crying simultaneously like emotionally unstable weather systems colliding inside a small apartment. That night we barely slept. Rain moved softly outside the windows while we lay awake staring at the ceiling talking about everything and nothing. Would we be good parents? Could we afford this? Would our child grow up feeling American? Would they understand my language too? Parenting experts say expecting parents often experience identity anxiety because becoming responsible for another human immediately activates deeper fears about competence, belonging, and stability. Basically, your brain suddenly opens 50 emotional tabs at once and forgets how to close any of them. Pregnancy changed our relationship slowly but completely. Suddenly life became divided into before and after. Before pregnancy, our future still felt abstract and flexible. After pregnancy, every decision carried emotional weight. We discussed health insurance while eating breakfast. Compared stroller prices like economists negotiating international trade agreements. Argued gently about baby names with the seriousness of world leaders preventing war. No offense, he said one evening while scrolling through name ideas online, but some of your suggestions sound like fantasy novel characters. And your suggestions sound like accountants, I answered immediately. Relationship scientists actually found humor becomes especially important during major life transitions because shared laughter reduces stress hormones and strengthens emotional resilience. In simple language, if couples stop laughing together during stressful seasons, everything starts feeling heavier. My pregnancy also changed how I experienced language emotionally. Before, English still felt partly connected to survival and adaptation. But now English became the language of doctor appointments, parenting books, future plans, tiny baby clothes, and conversations about family. My emotional connection to America deepened because our child would belong here naturally in ways I once struggled to. That realization felt beautiful and painful at the same time. Some nights I worried quietly about losing parts of myself completely. Would my child speak my native language fluently? Would they understand my childhood stories? Would they know the songs my mother sang to me growing up? Immigrant parents carry invisible grief sometimes because love becomes translation work too. You spend years trying to preserve pieces of one world while building a life inside another. One afternoon during my second trimester, we attended a prenatal class at the local hospital. Imagine 20 exhausted adults sitting in folding chairs learning breathing techniques while pretending nobody feels emotionally terrified. Peak human behavior honestly. The instructor spoke quickly, using medical vocabulary that made my brain briefly leave civilization. Even after years in America, certain professional English situations still overwhelmed me occasionally. I leaned toward him halfway through class and whispered, I think this woman expects us to survive childbirth using yoga and optimism. He nearly choked trying not to laugh out loud. But later something unexpected happened. During a discussion about parenting fears, other couples started speaking honestly about anxiety, financial stress, relationship pressure, sleep deprivation, all the hidden fears nobody posts beautifully online. And suddenly I realized something comforting. Everyone felt unprepared. Everyone. Not just immigrants. Not just us. Psychologists studying parenthood found that uncertainty increases dramatically during pregnancy because humans instinctively understand the enormous responsibility approaching them. In other words, becoming a parent feels terrifying because your brain correctly recognizes the situation as important. Around 7 months into pregnancy, winter returned again. Rain covered downtown streets while cold wind rattled softly against apartment windows at night. One evening we sat together assembling a crib we absolutely underestimated emotionally. Furniture instructions are already dangerous for relationships under normal circumstances. Add pregnancy hormones and sleep deprivation? Civilization barely survives. At one point he accidentally attached an entire section backward while insisting confidently everything looked correct. "The baby cannot sleep diagonally," I said while trying not to laugh. "You don't know his artistic vision yet," he answered seriously. Somehow we spent 45 minutes fixing mistakes while laughing harder than expected. And suddenly, standing there surrounded by unfinished furniture and scattered screws, I realized something quietly important. Years earlier I arrived in America feeling lost, lonely, uncertain, and emotionally temporary. Now I was building a nursery with the man I loved while rain moved softly outside our apartment windows. Life had changed slowly enough that I barely noticed transformation happening. Then the night finally came. Labor started around 2 in the morning during one of the coldest rainstorms of the year. Hollywood completely lies about childbirth, by the way. Movies make it look dramatic but organized somehow. Real labor feels more like your body entering negotiations with chaos directly. We rushed through empty rainy streets toward the hospital while both of us panicked in completely different ways. "Do we have everything?" he kept asking every 3 minutes. "I don't know," emotionally I shouted back while contractions destroyed my remaining patience scientifically. Hours later, exhausted beyond language itself, I held our daughter for the first time beneath soft hospital lights while rain tapped quietly against distant windows outside. Tiny fingers. Tiny breathing sounds. Tiny face wrapped in blankets. And suddenly every difficult thing we survived together, loneliness, culture shock, financial stress, fear, misunderstandings, long winters, all of it felt connected somehow to this exact moment. He sat beside me holding our daughter carefully like she contained the meaning of existence itself. Then softly, almost whispering, he said, "We made a home." And for the first time since arriving in America years earlier, I realized he was right. Not because life became perfect. Not because fear disappeared forever. But because love, spoken slowly enough over time, had finally grown roots deep enough to hold all 3 of us. The little girl between 2 worlds. Nobody prepares you for the emotional chaos of raising a bilingual child in America. One minute you are proudly teaching your daughter words from your childhood. And the next minute she looks directly into your soul and asks why vegetables exist. Parenting already feels like improvising a complicated science experiment while sleep deprived. Add 2 languages, 2 cultures, and immigrant identity into the situation. Suddenly your household becomes a tiny international conference sponsored by snacks and emotional instability. Our daughter grew faster than my heart could emotionally process. One day she was sleeping against my chest wrapped in blankets while rain tapped softly outside the hospital windows. Then somehow she became a curious little girl running through the apartment asking 1,000 questions before breakfast with the energy of a caffeinated lawyer. Parenthood changes time strangely. Scientists studying memory formation found emotionally intense experiences alter our perception of time, making years feel simultaneously endless and unbelievably short. Basically, your brain becomes terrible at calendars once love attaches itself to everyday life. By the time our daughter turned 4, our apartment sounded like 3 different emotional worlds colliding together constantly. English filled most of daily life because we lived in Oregon, of course. School, television, grocery stores, playground conversations, everything around her moved naturally in English. But inside our home, I tried carefully protecting my native language too. Every night I read her children's books from my childhood. Every morning I taught her small expressions while making breakfast. Some days she repeated them perfectly. Other days she stared at me like I was introducing ancient wizard spells from another galaxy. "Why do I need 2 languages?" she asked one afternoon while coloring at the kitchen table. Honestly, children ask philosophical questions with terrifying confidence. I sat beside her quietly for a moment before answering. Because 2 languages mean 2 ways to understand the world. She considered this seriously for exactly 3 seconds before asking if cats have eyebrows. Parenthood is emotionally humbling like that. Researchers studying bilingual children discovered something beautiful though. Children raised with 2 languages often develop stronger cognitive flexibility and emotional awareness because their brains constantly adapt between different systems of communication. In simple language, their tiny brains become surprisingly powerful while adults still struggle remembering passwords. Still, raising a bilingual child came with hidden sadness sometimes. One evening during dinner, our daughter accidentally answered me only in English after I spoke in my native language. Such a tiny thing. Yet something inside me tightened painfully. Because immigrant parents quietly fear cultural disappearance all the time. You worry traditions will fade. Stories will fade. Pieces of yourself will slowly become invisible across generations. He noticed my expression immediately after dinner while we cleaned dishes together. "You okay?" he asked softly. I shrugged at first, but eventually admitted the truth. "I'm scared she'll grow up feeling disconnected from where I came from." He dried a plate quietly before answering. "Maybe she won't experience your culture exactly the way you did," he said gently. "But that doesn't mean she'll lose it." I wanted to believe him. Truly. But identity becomes complicated when your child belongs naturally to a country that once made you feel foreign. Sometimes I watched our daughter speaking rapid English with neighborhood children and felt proud and lonely at the exact same time. Psychologists call this immigrant generational tension. Parents often grieve silently because their children adapt more naturally to the new culture, creating emotional distance even inside loving families. One rainy Saturday afternoon, we visited a small multicultural festival downtown. Food stalls lined the streets while different languages floated through cold autumn air beside music and laughter. Our daughter held both our hands while asking endless questions about everything she saw. At one booth, traditional music from my home country played softly through old speakers. I stopped walking immediately. Something about hearing those familiar sounds in the middle of Oregon nearly broke my heart open. My daughter looked up at me curiously. "Do you know this song?" she asked. "Yes," I whispered. My mother used to play it when I was little. She stared at me thoughtfully for a moment before asking, "Can you teach it to me?" Honestly, children accidentally heal emotional wounds without realizing it sometimes. That night after she fell asleep, I sat quietly beside the apartment window watching rain move through downtown streets below. The city looked beautiful in that lonely American way it always had. Wet sidewalks glowing beneath streetlights. Coffee shops still open late. Cars passing slowly through cold air. Then he sat beside me holding 2 mugs of tea. "You're thinking too much again," he said gently. "It's my immigrant superpower," I answered. He laughed softly before growing more serious. "You know," he said, "she doesn't have to choose between worlds." I looked at him quietly. What if she feels like she belongs nowhere completely? I asked. Because secretly, that fear haunted me most. I knew that feeling too well already. Existing between cultures can feel beautiful and lonely at the same time. He thought carefully before answering. "Then we teach her what we learned," he said softly. "That belonging isn't always one place." His words stayed with me afterward. Because maybe identity is not something fixed forever. Maybe humans are meant to become combinations of experiences, languages, memories, and people we love. One evening during bedtime, our daughter asked me to tell her the story of how her father and I met. She loved hearing it repeatedly, though she always interrupted halfway through with important questions like, "Did Daddy look weird back then?" Children are ruthless interviewers, honestly. I told her about the rainy cafe, my nervous English, the small apartment above the hardware store, the difficult winters, and all the tiny moments that slowly built our life together. She listened carefully beneath soft yellow light while holding her stuffed rabbit against her chest. Then suddenly she asked something unexpected. "Were you scared when you moved to America?" The room became very quiet after that. I looked at her small face waiting seriously for my answer and realized children notice emotional truths much earlier than adults expect. "Yes," I admitted softly. "Very scared sometimes." "Then why did you stay?" she asked. I smiled slowly before answering. "Because eventually, I found people who made it feel like home." She seemed satisfied with that explanation and drifted towards sleep a few minutes later. But after leaving her room, I stood quietly in the hallway for a long moment thinking about everything we survived to reach this life. Loneliness. Language barriers. Financial stress. Fear. Cultural confusion. All of it now existed inside our daughter's story too, even if she would never fully understand those early years emotionally. Later that night, while sitting beside him on the couch listening to rain outside again like always, I realized something important. Slow love does not only change two people. Over time, it creates entire worlds. Tiny worlds filled with bedtime stories, mixed languages, family traditions, inside jokes, difficult memories, healing, resilience. And children growing between cultures with hearts large enough to carry all of it at once. And maybe that is the real miracle of lasting love. Not perfection. Not constant happiness. Just two imperfect people building enough safety together that another little human can grow up feeling loved in every language. A love that grew slowly. If you had told the younger version of me that one day I would sit inside a warm apartment in Oregon listening to my daughter laugh in 2 languages, while rain tapped softly against the windows beside the man I loved, I probably would have smiled politely and assumed you were emotionally unstable. Not because I did not believe in love. I did. secretly, quietly. But back then, I believed love belonged to confident people. Fluent people. People who understood their future clearly and walked through life without constantly second-guessing themselves. I did not realize yet that some of the strongest love stories begin with uncertainty instead of confidence. Years passed more quickly after our daughter grew older. That always happens somehow. Childhood moves like lightning disguised as routine. Suddenly tiny shoes appear beside the front door. School drawings cover refrigerators. Small voices ask huge questions at 7 in the morning before your coffee emotionally prepares you for existence. And through all those ordinary years, life kept changing around us quietly. We eventually moved from the small apartment above the hardware store into a modest house farther outside town where pine trees surrounded the backyard and rain sounded softer at night against the roof. The house was not impressive. The kitchen cabinets squeaked. The hallway light flickered occasionally like it carried unresolved emotional trauma. But it was ours. Fully ours. And honestly, adulthood changes your definition of success in strange ways. Luxury starts looking less important than peace. One autumn evening, after putting our daughter to bed, we sat together on the back porch wrapped in blankets while cold air moved gently through the trees. Oregon looked beautiful at night. Quiet streets. Distant porch lights glowing softly. Rain beginning again somewhere far away like it always seemed to in this state. We sat there without speaking for a while, listening to the peaceful silence that only exists after children finally fall asleep. Then he looked at me and smiled softly. "Do you remember the first time we talked at the cafe?" he asked. I laughed immediately. "I barely understood half your sentences." "You understood enough," he answered. And somehow that tiny conversation stayed with me afterward. Because when I looked back at our entire relationship, I realized something surprising. The strongest parts of our love were never dramatic moments. Not grand speeches. Not perfect vacations. Not movie-style romance. The strongest parts were always small. Slow. Repetitive. Rainy walks after difficult days. Cheap dinners during stressful winters. Late-night conversations beside apartment windows. Holding hands quietly in hospital rooms. Laughing over parenting disasters and burnt pancakes. Listening patiently while the other person searched for words emotionally or linguistically. Relationship scientists discovered something fascinating about long-term couples. Emotional security is built less through intensity and more through consistency. Small repeated moments of care actually reshape the nervous system over time, increasing feelings of safety, trust, and resilience. In other words, lasting love grows slowly because human hearts trust slowly. And honestly, that makes sense. Real intimacy would probably terrify us if it arrived all at once. Sometimes people still ask me how I learned English so naturally after struggling so much in the beginning. They expect complicated answers involving advanced grammar systems or expensive programs. But the truth feels almost too simple. I learned English through connection. Through stories. Through repetition. Through emotion. Through listening carefully to ordinary conversations during ordinary days with people I loved. Neuroscientists studying language acquisition found emotional relevance strongly improves memory retention because the brain prioritizes meaningful experiences over abstract information. Basically, your brain remembers language faster when your heart becomes attached to it too. That is why I still remember certain English phrases exactly the way he first said them years earlier. Take your time. You're safe here. We'll figure it out. Tiny sentences. Yet they carried entire emotional worlds inside them. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning old boxes in the garage, I found one of my first English notebooks from years ago. Inside were messy vocabulary lists, grammar mistakes, pronunciation notes, and awkward practice sentences written nervously in uneven handwriting. I sat on the floor flipping through pages while laughing softly at my old mistakes. Then suddenly emotion hit me unexpectedly hard. Because every imperfect sentence inside that notebook belonged to a younger version of me who felt terrified and lonely but kept trying anyway. Growth feels invisible while it happens. That is the frustrating part. Humans expect transformation to feel dramatic. But most real change occurs quietly beneath daily life until one day you realize the person you once were would barely recognize you now. He walked into the garage and found me staring at the notebook silently. "What's wrong?" he asked gently. I smiled while wiping tears from my face. "Nothing's wrong," I answered softly. "I just remembered how scared I used to be." He sat beside me on the floor without speaking immediately. Then finally he said something simple. "You still did it anyway." That sentence settled deep inside me because maybe courage never means feeling fearless. Maybe courage simply means continuing slowly while fear walks beside you. Over the years, our daughter grew into someone beautifully confident in ways I never was at her age. She switched between languages naturally. Made friends easily. Asked impossible questions at dinner. Sometimes she complained dramatically about homework like it personally betrayed her family. Completely normal child behavior. But occasionally she would ask about my early years in America, and I always tried answering honestly. Not only the beautiful parts. The lonely parts too. Because I wanted her to understand something important. Belonging is not always immediate. Confidence is not always natural. And love, real love, is rarely fast. One evening, while helping her practice reading before bed, she suddenly looked up from her book and asked, "Do you think slow love lasts longer?" Children ask questions like philosophers wearing pajamas. I smiled quietly because she had no idea how deeply that question connected to our entire story. I thought carefully before answering. "Sometimes," I said softly. Because slow love learns people completely before promising forever. She nodded thoughtfully like that answer made perfect sense, then immediately asked for snacks. Human attention spans are humbling honestly. Later that night, after she fell asleep, I stood alone beside the kitchen window watching rain move across the backyard beneath soft yellow porch lights. The house felt peaceful around me. Warm. Lived in. Real. And suddenly I understood something that took me years to learn. Home is not where your life becomes perfect. Home is where you finally stop feeling emotionally temporary. Love did not save me magically. America did not suddenly become easy. Fear never disappeared completely. But slowly, through thousands of ordinary moments, I built a life sturdy enough to hold joy and uncertainty at the same time. And maybe that is the real reason slow love sometimes lasts longer. It does not rush people toward fantasy. It gives them time to become fully human beside each other first. So if you are learning English slowly right now, or building a life slowly, or healing slowly, or loving slowly, please remember this. Slow does not mean failing. Some things grow beautifully precisely because they take time. Rain falls slowly too. But eventually, it changes entire landscapes. And maybe that is the strangest truth about life. The people who change us forever rarely arrive loudly. Sometimes they enter quietly, during rainy evenings, slow conversations, awkward English mistakes, cheap coffee, difficult winters, and ordinary days we almost forget to notice. Yet years later, we realize those small moments built the entire shape of our hearts. If you are still struggling to learn English, still feeling lonely, still rebuilding your confidence after heartbreak, failure, or change, please don't quit too early. Real growth is usually invisible at first. Your brain is learning even when progress feels slow. Your heart is healing even when the pain still visits at night. And your future may already be walking toward you quietly while you are busy doubting yourself. That is why slow love sometimes lasts longer. And maybe slow healing does too. Somewhere tonight, another person is sitting alone trying to practice English while secretly wondering if they are too late, too broken, too shy, or too far behind. Maybe this story was not only about love. Maybe it was about becoming brave enough to stay open to life again. So if this story made you feel calmer, understood, inspired, or simply less alone, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more slow English stories about love, life, culture, family, marriage, and emotional healing in America. Every new video is designed to help you improve your English listening, reading, speaking, pronunciation, vocabulary, and confidence naturally through real human stories and slow English conversation practice. And before you leave, tell me something in the comments. Do you believe slow love lasts longer? Or do you think modern life moves too fast for that now? I read your comments carefully, and honestly, some of your stories feel like entire movies hidden inside one sentence. Until next time, keep practicing slowly, keep speaking bravely, and remember this: rain falls one drop at a time. But eventually it changes everything.